Доброго вечора, шановне панство. Я називаюся Йоханан Петровський Штерн, я учений секретар, не дуже учений, але секретар НТШ і професор історії в Northwestern University. Мені випала висока честь представити сьогодні нашого гостя, професора Серхія Плохія. I have an honor to introduce to you Professor Serhii Plokhii, who is the Mikhailo Grushevsky Chair of Ukrainian History and the Director of Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. And what I would like to do today, instead of reading to you the list of 27 monographs of Professor Plokhy and telling you how great he is, what is his fantastic visibility, he talks to Fukuyama, he is on CNN and most important TV venues discussing Ukraine, explaining the importance of Ukraine. I would like to do something very different that I did not warn about either Serhii Plokhii or anybody else. It'll be a kind of an improvised foray into the intellectual upbringing of Serhii Plokhii, which I'll try to make brief and still concise and I hope important. Serhii Plokhii was born in Nizhny Novgorod, if I'm not mistaken. He grew up in Zaporizhia. He came of age and became a serious historian in Dnipro. He continued his career in Moscow and Alberta before he came to Harvard University. So it is quite an itinerary. And on this itinerary, I would like to mention 2 points. One of them is scholarly and another is anecdotal, but both of them are relevant to the career of Serhii Plokhii, who I consider really a giant in scholarship and in terms of his importance for what we do in Ukrainian studies and in our attempts to put Ukraine on the map of the Western scholarship. Serhii Plokhii came to Dnipropetrovsk University to study history. And you might not know that there are many great historians and important historians in Ukraine, but actually in the 1970s, 1980s, there was only one historiographical school that I can say is really a very important, probably the typical and unique Ukrainian historiographical school. And it was Железнавча школа в Дніпрі. And Serhii kind of absorbed the historical profession with the sense of the sources and with the understanding of the extreme importance of getting back to the sources. 16th century, 17th century, whatever they are, whatever their language, Polish, Latin, doesn't matter. You need to control the sources. And that is kind of the intellectual upbringing of Serhii Plokhii. Well, he decided to write his dissertation about the sources behind the Khmelnytsky revolution, 1648, 1649, and onward until the Pereyatovskaya, 1654. And he is taking his Latin sources, going with the sources to different institutions and saying, I would like to write a dissertation with you, and they say no. He says, I would like to write a dissertation with you, they say no. So every particular institution that he is trying to address basically closes his door to him, and he cannot really do the work analyzing for the first, in many cases, for the first time, Latin language sources that are reflecting the Polish and non-Polish vision of what 1648 is all about in Ukrainian history. And he ends up, lo and behold, at the University of Patrice Lumumba in Moscow. And he knocks at the door, and the person opens the door, and he says, I'm sorry, I'm kind of reforming what you told me. And he says, I'm writing my dissertation on the Latin sources, and they say, oh, we have here Latin studies, and it was Latin American Studies department. please come to us. We are looking for people who are doing exactly that. So this is how Serhii Plokhii managed to write his dissertation at the Patrice Lumumba University. And one of my Jerusalem supervisors, Professor Shaul Stamfer, 30 years later, tells me, Yochanan, do whatever you can to find a copy at Patrice Lumumba University of that dissertation, because it's very important for me as a scholar of 17th century Ukrainian Jewry. So then Serhii Plokhii is taking his Jeroznavstvo and looks through the entirety of Ukrainian history, questioning the sources and showing actually that the sources can tell us stories that we have never heard about Ukraine, turning upside down our vision of what Historia Rusiv is about, explaining to us what is behind the Russian war in Ukraine, telling us what Hrushevsky is actually trying to do late in the 19th century. And what he does really is done in conversation with the cutting-edge historiography in the West. And that makes Serhii Plokhii really a unique scholar among us, as I'm myself, ethnocentric Ukrainian historians. And that really singles him out, and that posits him really in the center of the European Western science of history. So let me introduce to you Professor Serhii Plokhii with his lecture «Крах панруської ідеї. Російсько-українська війна в історичній перспективі». The fall of the pan-Russian idea, the Russia-Ukrainian war in historical perspective. Сергій, вибачте мене за неформальну презентацію. Прошу.
First of all, thank you. Дуже дякую за це представлення. Thanks a lot, Professor Petrovsky-Stern. And yeah, I will admit I recognized parts of that myself in parts of that story. Not the entire story, but I'm very grateful. And yeah, that's a sort of introduction which is called no pressure introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to see all of you, a lot of familiar faces, and address the topic that really brings together a lot of history, but also our contemporary developments in Ukraine. The talk is about the fate of one of the intellectual constructs, one of the ideas that underpinned this current war, which is the largest war in Europe since 1945, the largest war in the world since at least the Korean War in the last 70 years, and that already has a tremendous impact on the world and on the international affairs, but it also has a major impact on the story of the formation, transformation of Ukrainian identity, and I'm sure the same impact will be there on the transformation of the Russian thinking about themselves and Russian idea. The first missile that was fired in that war, in its latest stage, the all-out war on Ukraine, was not fired on the morning of February 24th of 2022. It was fired at least half a year earlier. And I use missile metaphorically here. The title of that particular statement, of that particular piece of writing, bear the name of President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and the title was on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I remember the discussions among my colleagues, both here in the United States and in Ukraine. What should we do about that? If you engage with a piece that is so really bizarre on the intellectual level and outdated, don't you provide some sort of legitimacy to that? Because immediately the situation occurs that, okay, this is one position, this is another position, they're equal, positions, and probably there is truth, or maybe truth is somewhere in the middle. One of my friends in Kiev said that, well, the whole idea of publishing this piece in, it seems to me, late June or early July was that everyone is on vacation and no one will notice that, and it will be not so intellectually embarrassing. That was the thinking of us academics, and thinking about our field, about integrity of our field, about the sort of discussions and debates that we are willing or not willing to have. Later it became very clear and very obvious that that particular piece was intellectual or pseudo-intellectual legitimization for the start of the war that I just described. The largest war in Europe in terms of the military forces on the ground, the equipment that is being used, the atrocities that are being committed, the number of refugees that are being produced, and so on and so forth. But the beginning of that stage wasn't that piece. And what was it? It was a relatively long piece of pseudo-history. The key argument was right there in the first paragraph, in the first sentences of that article, which said that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. And Putin says that I kept saying that again and again, and he was absolutely correct on that. The first recorded case when Putin said that was in the summer of 2013, half a year or so before or maybe closer to 1 year before the start of the war, which began in February of 2014. So, and the rest of the essay was providing a sort of historical justification for this idea. So where does the idea that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people is coming from? And that's where I start this intellectual/political journey into the history of idea. And I will end it with now the current state of the idea in the context of the war. I'll walk you through the way how the idea was born and formulated, how it was brought back and reborn in the post-Soviet Russia, and then how it went through this current war, two stages of the war, that one started in 2014 and another in 2022. So that's basically roughly the structure what I'm going to talk about. Now, what Putin and those who support that vision are really saying when they're saying Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, they're not saying that Russians are really Ukrainians. They're saying that Ukrainians are really Russians, which means that Ukrainians don't exist or are not supposed to exist. And to a degree that they exist, to believe that they exist, this is a historical mistake. Mistake that Putin attributes to two factors. One was this outside influences and meddling into the quote-unquote Russian affairs, and then the mistakes made by the Russian leaders themselves. And among the forces that are being certainly responsible for the creation of the Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian identity would be Poles and Austrian general staff and so on and so forth, so all these usual suspects on that side. When he goes after the Russian leaders who were responsible for that, the list doesn't look like usual suspects list, especially for those who are familiar with Ukrainian history, because on that list are Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, who in Putin's reading of the history actually are responsible for being too soft on nationalities in general and Ukrainians in particular. And the idea that Ukraine is really the creation of Lenin, that's one of the illustrations of that particular thinking and that particular argument. Now, Putin, especially in today's Russia, is a very, very powerful person. The decision to attack Ukraine in 2014 was apparently made by him and a very limited circle of people around him and came as a surprise to a good part of the Russian elite. The same can be said certainly about the all-out war in 2022. But one thing that Putin is not, he is not an original thinker. So this is not something that he came up with, as he describes, that archival materials were delivered to him and he was writing this piece, and that's where the ideas are coming from. The ideas are actually very traditional when it comes to a traditional, what Hrushevsky called a traditional or usual scheme of Russian history. The idea that Ukrainians and Russians constitute one big Russian nation is really, that idea comes from the 19th century, that idea comes from the 19th century. This is part of the imperial historiography and part of imperial thinking. The trigger for the formulation of the concept of the Russian nation that consists out of three tribes of Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians or Belarusians really was formulated in the 1860s, around the time of and to a degree as a reaction to the Polish uprising of 1863. In these walls, certainly more than once, the references were made to the Valuev Circular, to 1863, to the prohibition of the Ukrainian publication in the Russian Empire, and prohibition for the import of Ukrainian published book into the Russian Empire. That was exactly the time and the moment when the Russian political and cultural establishment was faced with the question of what to do with the rising Ukrainian movement. And one of the solutions was, okay, we will arrest the development of that movement. It's one thing when intellectuals are discussing these ideas and reading poetry one to each other. It's another when we would allow the publication in Ukrainian Bible or primers and so on and so forth. That's the red line. We will not allow anybody to cross it. Around the same time, the concept is being formulated that the Russian nation really consists of three parts. Very often we have this tendency to go back, I'm talking about historians, all the way to the 17th century and saying, okay, that the Great Russia, Little Russia, and White Russia appear in the title of the Russian Tsar already after the Pereyaslav Agreement, which is true. But this is a very different story from the not just parts of the territory, but of nations, of separate nations, existing and then being united in one. By 1863, it was also already by that time impossible to deny the existence of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature. So the model was that, yes, Ukrainians exist, they talk funny, they dance funny, and they're wonderful singers, but they are part of the big Russian nation. And that's exactly the origins, that's the beginning of the idea that now, already in the 21st century, the idea lifted from 1860s, from 1870s, and now introduced in the first decades of the 21st century. That's where the idea is coming from. Now, if you put Putin's article in that relatively long durée process of the formation of that idea, it becomes clearer why Lenin and Stalin end up, in his reading, in his opinion, on the wrong side of history. Because what happened with the Russian Empire in 1917 and 1918, and again, quite often there is very little realization of that. The Russian Empire fell apart. It fell apart in the same way how Austria-Hungary fell apart. It fell apart in the same way how the Ottoman Empire fell apart. What is different is that then in the Russian Empire appeared a force called the Bolsheviks, who with the help of brutal force and innovative internationalist ideology were able to stitch the empire together by making, among other things, symbolic and cultural concessions to the nationalities. And one of those concessions was the recognition of the existence of Ukrainian nation as a separate nation. And by the year 1922, 1923, you see already that it's not just the recognition of the existence of the nation, but that particular nation acquires its own borders within the Soviet Union, pro forma equal status to Russia, which for the first time in history acquires borders and institutions different from the borders and institutions of the empire. So the wonderful world that Putin and people around him worship, the world of the Russian Empire before 1917, falls apart. And that is the main sin of Lenin and Stalin when it comes to the Ukrainian question in the eyes of Putin. They just recognized the right of those people to exist when they're not supposed to exist. Now, we know that Putin read some Russian and Russian emigre authors, and Ivan Ilyin is one of them. Tim Snyder has been writing about that. He read Denikin, but more important figure in transmitting the ideas of the Russian Empire of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century to Russia of the late 20th and the beginning of the 21st century is the person called Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I already stated on a number of occasions that the intellectual fingerprints of Solzhenitsyn are all over this war that is happening today in Ukraine. And I'll develop that, or rather than develop, I'll actually provide some more details on that particular statement. Because what Solzhenitsyn does, he takes the imperial ideas of the 19th and 20th century and then tries to translate them into the language of the 20th century. In 1990, he publishes the very important essay which was called How We Should Restructure Russia, published by Izvestia, Komsomolskaya Pravda, so every major newspaper in the Soviet Union in the year 1990, and highly discussed, widely discussed. And the idea there is that, well, it's time to bid farewell to Central Asia and to Caucasus and to the Baltic states. So there should be a different, because the Soviet Union was unfair to the Russians. Russians were among the main victims of the communism and of the Soviet regime. That's Solzhenitsyn's position, that's Solzhenitsyn's platform. Where this Russia will be on the map, if that happens, well, it would include Ukraine, it would include Belarus, it would include also North Kazakhstan, the areas that were settled mostly by East Slavs as part of the Virgin Lands campaign in the second half of the 1950s. If you look at the classic definition of what nationalism is, the nationalism is quite often defined as the principle according to which the political borders, the state borders, should coincide with ethnic and cultural borders. So if you take this principle and you take Solzhenitsyn's map, what you see is his reconstructuring Russia is Russia that includes Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia as well. So he is a pan-Russian nationalist in this incarnation of 1990. He's not using the offensive words coming from the imperial past. He is not calling Ukrainians little Russians. He says, my mother is Ukrainian. I met all these Ukrainians in the Gulag. This is a big issue. We will have to discuss that with them. But deep down, he is basically there building the pan-Russian state in 1990, and is very upset in December of 1991 when he learns that the majority of Ukrainians, not just in Ukraine as a whole, but even the majority of the population in Crimea, voted for Ukrainian independence in 1991. So what you see is that the imperial idea that was formulated in the wake of the Polish uprising of 1863, which coincides in time with the first official and big prohibitions of the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian publications, it successfully survives the Soviet times. Solzhenitsyn was not, as an individual, as the writer, as the author, was not on his own. He represented a particular trend and a particular thinking. And they were not just dissidents like him who were arrested and first arrested and then expelled from the Soviet Union. They were institutions that embodied the old idea, the imperial Russian idea of the existence of pan-Russian nation consisting of maybe different tribes that can be accommodated in one way or another, but still it is the same nation. The institution that I have in mind is called Russian Orthodox Church. The post-revolutionary developments of 1920s saw the development in Russia, in Ukraine, in parts of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, a number of religious organizations and institutions. Some of them were organized around national idea, and Ukrainian Autocephalous Church was one of them. Others were preoccupied with the idea that all traditional orthodoxy had to be reformed. And the so-called living church, or Zhivaya church, came into existence. The Obnovlenцы became a major force in Russia and also in Ukraine. The idea was about the reforming of the traditional religion. And the Bolsheviks would support that in the 1920s because for them it was very important to undermine anything associated with the former dominant church that in their mind, and not only in their mind, was closely associated with the imperial regime. But by the late 1920s and early 1930s, all of these churches, Renovationists, Living Church, Autocephalous Church, Ukraine, Belarusian, they're gone. They're all put together under the auspices of one Russian Orthodox Church, which is actually prohibited to reform in any way. So in the Soviet Union, the Communist Party in the last decades of the Soviet regime was called the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It started as the all-Russian Bolshevik Party in the 1920s, but eventually changed and structurally and otherwise to accommodate this new reality of the Soviet Union. The one institution that didn't do that was the Russian Orthodox Church. So apart from the idea and the group of dissident writers, Russian dissident writers, there was also an institution that brought into the 1990s. Solzhenitsyn goes back and revises his old idea. And he writes in particular in the work that appeared under the title "The Россия в обвале," Russia is in collapse. Thank you. So Russia is in collapse. He says that, well, if you can't get Ukraine back altogether, at least we should get back Donbass, we should get back Kherson, we should get back Melitopol, we should get back southern Ukraine. Look at the map of the current war in Ukraine. And all of these place names, they were unknown for the general public generally before the start of this war. Now they're almost in every reportage coming from the war in Ukraine. that's the idea of Greater Russia, where Solzhenitsyn was saying those people speak Russian, they're Russians. These territories became part of Russia as the result of the Ottoman-Russian wars. Exactly what Putin was just saying a few days ago in his yearly press conference. So, if you can't get all of Ukraine, get parts of Ukraine that you consider to be historically, culturally, and otherwise Russian. So at the end of the day, by 2013, 2014, we see three different complexes of ideas at work. One of them would be the pan-Russian idea, the one that I'm focusing on today. Another is the complex of thinkers, ideas associated with pan-Slavism, and then the concept of Greater Russia, which basically means actually let's bring under the Russian control the territories settled by Russians, and then there are different ways how you define those Russians, linguistically, culturally, ethnically, and so on and so forth. And once the war starts in 2014, it starts with really a combination of all these ideas. They're all in play at the same time. There has been a lot of talk on the Russian side in 2014 and 2022 and today about war on the Russian side to be a defensive war. The war against the encroaching West, and the proof of an encroaching West has been the NATO expansion. So that's at least one of the official narratives. The reality is, if you look at the start of the war in 2013, where does it start and how it starts? It starts with the Russian special forces taking over the buildings of the Crimean parliament and Crimean government, dragging in the members of the Crimean parliament into the building and forcing them to vote in the way how, at that point, Kremlin wanted them to vote. Why is this happening? The context for that are, of course, the events known as the Euro Revolution and then Revolution of Dignity. The outcome of the Revolution of Dignity is that Yanukovych is out and the new leadership is in. The leadership is still kind of, they create a provisional cabinet, and Turchinov is the acting president. But what is not provisional is that they're saying, okay, we are going to sign association agreement with European Union. If this reading of mine is correct, and if really the association agreement with European Union is at the core of the start of the war in February of 2014, what that means is the war really about keeping Ukraine within the Russian sphere of influence. All of Ukraine, entire Ukraine. But for a number of reasons, the way how things proceed, they proceed with occupation of Crimea alone, which fits again, going back to different intellectual tools in the imperialist toolbox, would fit the idea of the Greater Russian nation. Crimea happened to be the only part of Ukraine where not only the Russian language was dominant, but also where the Russians constituted the majority. And I attended a number of conferences where people, Russian scholars, non-Russian scholars, absolutely honestly were saying, okay, this is just one-off. There will be nothing happening after that. So the argument was more or less the same as we understand was around Anschluss back in the late 1930s. Yes, of course it's illegal, but weren't Germans punished too harsh by the Paris Peace Treaty? Isn't this in line with President Wilson's 14 points of self-determination? Isn't this true that German-speaking Austrians have the right to belong to the one German state? So basically, that was more or less the position of the West over the Crimea. that was perceived to be in many ways the bump on the road to the eventual normalization of relations with Russia. The trick was that it didn't stop with the Crimea. It didn't stop with the Crimea because the goal was still the same, to keep the entire Ukraine within the Russian sphere of influence. So after that, you have a ultimatum saying that either you rewrite your constitution or we'll do something to you. And that something to you was the start of the war, in Donbass. The Minsk agreements, Minsk Agreement 1 and Minsk Agreement 2, were about the realization of basically the same model. Ukraine rewrites its constitution, where it would become ungovernable state, a sort of confederation in which every region would have the power, the veto power, over the foreign policy orientation of Ukraine. And that was the hope all the way until the year 2020, until the year 2021, when in Moscow the realization came that actually President Zelensky, and there were very high hopes for Zelensky in Moscow, that Zelensky is not actually going to deliver Ukraine as a confederation and accept the Minsk agreements in the Russian reading of that document. So what we see again at play, there are all these three. It's maybe I'm getting, it becomes more and more complicated, but at game there are these three different ideological and intellectual and geopolitical scenarios, from Eurasian to one Russian nation, one big Russian nation, which in case of Ukraine coincide. There is no difference between them. Ukraine under one scenario, intellectual scenario, and under another intellectual scenario should be part of, if not Russia, then Russian sphere of influence. And then the third one, Greater Russia, where parts of Ukraine are integrated into Russia itself. And the war starts in 2022 with basically the declaration of the war, or equivalent of declaration of the war. Russia declares that it actually withdraws from the Minsk agreements and annexes the territory now not only of Crimea, but also the territory of Donbass. By September of 2022, you see changes in the Russian constitution, where to that list are also added the regions of Kherson and Zaporizhia. So this is the Greater Russian scenario in play, in the context where the idea of one big Russian nation is not completely abandoned, but certainly put on pause for particular reasons. Now, so far I was talking about Ukraine, and with special emphasis on Donbass and Crimea in the south, with either Russian majority in the Crimea or the dominance of the Russian language in those issues. There are, as you know very well, there are other regions in Ukraine as well, and one of those regions is Galicia and Western Ukraine in general. And what we hear is that Western Ukraine was actually never in the plans of Vladimir Putin to either fully integrating it in Russia or fully integrating it in the Russian sphere of influence if the plan A, the plan of the Eurasian Union, doesn't materialize. And we certainly know the fillers coming at that time from Zhirinovsky, and also statements made in Moscow to the Polish representatives, including the new Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, where the idea was, okay, you can take that part of Ukraine, either Poland or Hungary, they can take it, we don't want it, we don't need it. Which actually very interesting, again, from the point of view of intellectual history, very interesting change and very interesting turn of events, because Lviv and Galicia were certainly claimed by the Russian Empire during World War I as the Russian land. Nicholas II was writing in his either letter or diary, I don't remember right now, but really Lviv was the place where he found this unity between the Tsardom and the Russian people. And the Russian people were, of course, the Russophile, the Moscophiles of Galicia. In 1939 and then in 1945, the Red Army moves into Lviv and now claims Lviv on behalf of Soviet and Socialist Ukraine. Not anymore, doesn't do that anymore under the banner of the big Russian nation. Ukrainians already recognized, so it's basically a new incarnation of the imperial thinking. In 2014 and 2022, at least the way how the current government in Russia behaves, there is no interest in Lviv anymore. So from claiming Lviv for the big Russian nation to claiming Lviv for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is part of the Soviet Union, to saying to the Poles, okay, just take this damn part of Ukraine and we are not interested in it. Which, whatever that means for the intellectual history and intellectual trajectory and geopolitics, one thing is very clear, that resistance does pay off. Maybe not immediately, not in the short term, but in long term, and that changes the imperial thinking about where the empire starts, where the empire ends, and what undertaking, what expedition, military or otherwise, can be conducted as a special military operation, and which one can lead to the war that damages or potentially damages the regime itself. So far I was talking about Russia in different incarnations, from imperial to Soviet to post-Soviet, which I sort of have an excuse and reason to do that, because the lecture is about the pan-Russian idea, and Russia is and Russian intellectuals and institutions are the core of either story when it comes to the formulation of this idea or reformulation of it. Now, very few ideas, intellectual or political or otherwise, just fall on their own under the pressure of inconsistencies and conflicts in within. They normally fall when they actually encounter resistance. That's what I was talking about. And the part of my presentation that I'm going to focus on now is that resistance coming from Ukraine in particular. My personal belief that one of the biggest mistakes that Putin had done, because I have no doubt that he clearly wasn't prepared for the resistance, he wasn't prepared for the war that happened after that, was that there was sense in Moscow that Ukraine was changing. And there was sense that, okay, something has to be done now because before the change didn't become irreversible. But I think, going to the mistake, that I don't think that there was full appreciation of the change that happened in Ukraine between the year 2013 and the year 2022. And the biggest mistake was attacking Ukraine of 2022, pretty much believing that it's basically Ukraine of 2014, and that there will be another Crimea operation, which would be a little bit more difficult. That's why we need more armed forces. Ukraine underwent a very, very profound transformation between the year 2013 and 2014. The sort of the attack that happened in 2022, if it would happen in 2013, probably we would not have Ukraine today on the map, or maybe Western Ukraine would be still there, but not the rest. The war of 2013, the annexation of the Crimea, the war in Donbass became really an existential threat to the Ukrainian society and to the Ukrainian state and to Ukrainian elites. And it produced changes that became obvious almost overnight. Oksana Shevin was showing here the map of elections and Ukraine divided between East and West, and that was the story since the revolution of 2004, pretty much. Even earlier, we can talk about that since the first presidential elections. Ukraine was divided even in a worse way than United States are divided, because there was very clear this geographical divide and geographical division, which we don't have, or we have in a different way in the United States. But suddenly, all of that disappeared in the year 2014 when it came to the presidential elections of President Poroshenko. It was a landslide. In the first round, Ukrainians agreed on who should be their president. In 2019, a very different person with very different background, to a great degree with a different vision for the country and different message, was elected the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. The map, basically, when it comes to the 90% of Ukrainian territory, didn't change. It was another landslide. The division, the war changed the political map of Ukraine, which tells you also something about the level of unity that emerged in Ukraine as the result of two developments. The first one was that Crimea and Donbass were not taking part in the elections anymore. But the second was that basically those who were taking part in the elections felt the need for unity on the level that they didn't feel before that. At Harvard, we have this project called MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine, where among a number of modules, one of the modules is on contemporary Ukraine. And we were looking at the changes in attitudes of people, comparing the data from 2013 and then through the war in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, and looking at geographical changes and shifts. And there was very interesting phenomenon in terms of self-reporting of people on the use of the Ukrainian language, which suddenly went not through the roof, but certainly went up in the year 2014 and 2016. But then it went down. The threat disappeared. So people didn't feel that they had to report that they were speaking Ukrainian at home or at work, when eventually they maybe were not speaking, or were speaking Surjik or something like that. But that sort of phenomenon that we saw with the language didn't translate itself into politics, because otherwise the map for the election of Zelensky would be actually like the map of elections before 2014, and it didn't change. So it wasn't, election of Poroshenko was not just a reaction to the moment of threat. That was the beginning of the change that then of course stayed with the Ukrainian society after that. For those of us who traveled to Ukraine, we certainly couldn't help but see the profound difference in what was happening in Ukrainian bookstores. And we all either write or read, so we go to the bookstores, and that's why I'm bringing this example. So the Ukrainization in both thematically and also linguistically, in terms of what was happening in Ukraine, was absolutely obvious in these bookstores, even more than it was maybe obvious on the streets. Where, again, if you belong to the right bubble on the Facebook, you saw that the younger generation was actually voluntarily choosing Ukrainian over Russian, when their parents and grandparents very often were speaking Russian. The tendency that certainly became much more pronounced in the year 2022 with the start of the all-out aggression, which demonstrated a very different different quality of the Ukrainian society that didn't exist before. Ukrainians and Ukrainian government in early days and weeks and months of 2022 was preparing, to a degree like Russia, to the repetition of the scenario of 2014. In January, Zelensky goes to the Kherson Oblast on the border with the Crimea, and there are exercises that bring together the military, the border guards, the police, firefighters, and so on and so forth. So what the exercises are about? They are playing out the scenario of Donbass of 2014. The idea is that, okay, Russia from the Crimea starts to spread all sorts of disinformation. There is chaos that comes to the fore in one of the cities and the villages. There are groups like Strelkov group appear here and there, and then what the Ukrainian response should be. So that's what they were preparing for and training for in few weeks before the all-out aggression from the Crimea. What we know after the start of the Crimea, that really in Donbass, in southern Ukraine and in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass scenario of 2014 didn't come back to life. There were no people running around and electing the people's mayors, declaring independence from Ukraine. What we all saw on TV were the Russian-speaking citizens of Melitopol and Berdyansk and Kherson marching with the Ukrainian flags on the Russian tanks. So there was the level and the miracle of the Ukrainian resistance. No one expected it to last for more than a few days or few weeks. Really, the main explanation of that miracle, there are many factors that went into that, but really changed society, Ukrainian society that changed itself between 2013 and 2022. Where does this leave pan-Russian idea? There was debate going on in 2013, 2014, 2015 about what was the nature of Leninapad, the removal of statues of Lenin, something that started from below and then became the official law voted by the majority in the Ukrainian parliament in 2015. Was it about the rejection of the Soviet past? Was it about the rejection of Russia and Russian dominance? The debate is still going on. The same story was about famine of 1932, Holodomor of 1932-1933. Was it about the rejection and condemning the crimes of the communist regime, or was that an anti-Russian movement or an anti-Russian trend? Again, the discussion on some level still goes on. But when you see in March of 1922 the monument to the Russian-Ukrainian friendship that survived 2013, 2014, and 2015, being removed from Khreshchatyk. If you see the starting of the process that one of my students is calling Pushkinapad, and her dissertation master's dissertation, I guess, thesis, will be on comparing Leninapad and Pushkinapad. You realize that basically what is at stake there, it's basically not only about the communist legacy, it is very specifically related to the relationship between those people and Russia. When you go today in Kiev, and in particular in Podol, where Ukrainian was present before, suddenly you realize that Ukrainian becomes the dominant language on the streets of Podil. Sociologists, anthropologists, there is a lot of work for them to be done. But for me as a historian, certain things, like for everybody else, people coming from all other disciplines, certain things are already clear and certain things are very visible. You read articles like the one that was written by Krasnyashchik, Russian scholar and Russian writer from Kharkiv, about the destruction of the Russian cultural sites and monuments by the Russian bombardment of Kharkiv and of other cities. You have very difficult time to produce a counter-argument to the idea that really in the fire of the war of 2022 and 2023, one thing that has been destroyed any desire of either Ukrainian population at large or Ukrainian cultural elite to either think about itself or associate themselves in one way or other with Russia. We had earlier the discussion about whether it's right or not right term, the cancel culture vis-a-vis so-called good Russians. We can debate that and discuss, but actually the phenomenon is there, and the only reading of the phenomenon is basically this extreme form of really separating yourself from the aggressor. We are in a difficult, and that's where I want to end. We are in a very difficult moment in this war today. There were so far two turning points in this war. The first one was in the first days of the war, and it's basically encapsulated in the words of President Zelensky. Basically, when he said that I don't need a right, I need ammunition. So Ukraine decides to fight back, which wasn't given, which was a surprise and really became the beginning of one turning point in the war. The second came in April of 1922, when the West realized that Ukraine actually was capable of fighting back. By that time, the Russian troops were already withdrawing from Kiev, and that country needs and deserves support, and not for partisan warfare, but for actually major war. Now we are in that another turning points in this war, whether the West and actually Western support will continue to come or not, on what level, and on the outcome of this debate, partially also on the outcome of developments here in the United States, depends the outcome of the war. So there is very many unknowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns in this war. It's far from over. We don't know how it will end. But my personal opinion that one part of that story, the story of the pan-Russian idea, and its history in Ukraine is pretty much over. It came to an end not even in the year 2023, it came in the year of 2022. The big question that I have is actually what this war and what its impact will be on Russia. And whether tens, even hundreds of thousands of body bags that are coming to Russia from the battlefields of Ukraine actually send a message. They send a lot of messages, but whether one of them, and important one, is actually that Russians and Ukrainians are not one and the same people. So thank you very much for your attention.
Дозвольте мені подякувати Серхію Плохію за прекрасну thought-provoking lecture. I would like to thank you very much for this thought-provoking lecture. I read it as a clash between political mythology on the one hand and facts on the ground on the other hand. So facts on the ground show us and demonstrate in a very profound and compelling way that Ukrainians do not want to be be made into the Russians, that Ukrainians respect their language, that Ukrainians would stand for their territorial integrity, that Ukrainians have democratic institutions, pro-European vector of development, and these are the facts that the political mythology, on the other hand, ignores. And this political mythology shows us, and I believe this is one of the takeaway issues, is that you are showing us the importance of the study of the genealogy of ideas, how this idea of pan-European, pan-Slavic political myth traveled through the 1860s, through the Soviet Union, through the 1990s, and then into modern day, shaping the modern day politics. And I would like to think about, together with you, and kind of share with you my humble contribution to this history of ideas, is that when we think about what Ruski Mir is about, we usually translate it as a Russian world, and I believe it's a misleading translation, because Russian world brings to mind the idea of war and peace, mir, right? Mir in Tolstoyan understanding of the word, and for Tolstoy it meant two things: mir as a peasant world, that is to say peasant community, and mir as a peace. So Russian world as a community of peace associated with the Russians, and this is what we, the Russians, need to defend. This is what Putin comes to defend. But actually, I think that Russian world should be translated, the Ruski Mir should be translated as the Russian realm, because the word realm brings in mind a very different political connotation. Of course, it is Lebensraum, it is the world which we control, and whoever speaks Russian in Brooklyn, in Israel, in Poland, in Eastern Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, will come to protect you from anybody who says you are not us. So I would like to hear from you. Do you think there is any correlation between Lebensraum and the Ruski Mir? And if it is, what does it mean for our understanding of how aggressive Russian imperialism is, and what are its geopolitical roots?
First of all, thank you for this comment. And I think the fact that mir in Russian means at least two things, I think, very important also for understanding of how the term Ruski Mir is perceived by Russian speakers. I think this is very, very important. In terms of realm, Lebensraum. Oh, sorry, I forgot that we are not just discussing this ideas between two of us. Sorry for that. So, when it comes to Lebensraum, I would ask for some time to think this through. I'll tell you what reservations I have. In my mind, Lebensraum, it's about territory, and about a territory that is actually not even yours and has to be conquered. When the Russian world, whatever term used for that, that's basically a concept linked to the territory, but the territory that is ours and historically ours, or at least that's how it is perceived. And as you said about Brooklyn and Israel and so on and so forth, it's exterritorial. So it is rooted in the idea of culture first and foremost. But generally, again, that's the whole trend, intellectual, cultural, and otherwise, that has to be explained. And my understanding is, and I don't know what realm of the Orthodox Church, it seems to me Kirill Hovorun is basically advocating the idea that the Ruski Mir, in the context of the Russian Orthodox Church, either has to be proclaimed to be a heresy or is heresy or something like that. So there is very important also church component and church definition of that term. So for me, it's basically territory is at the core, but it's much more than territorial concept.
Thank you. We will take questions. We would not take statements.
Well, then probably there will be no questions.
Okay. Yeah, Al, please.
I'm just wondering what is the opinion today.
Please raise your voice and address our presenter, not me.
I'd like to know We know what the general Ukrainian view is belonging to Russia. What is the situation now in the Donbass and also in the southern tier? Because I've heard different calculations about how many people are pro-Russian in the Donbass even today. Maybe you could comment on that.
Well, again, I'm not a political scientist, so I didn't conduct any research. I read a couple of articles here and there, and my understanding is that it's impossible question to answer, because you just, in the conditions of really military occupation, it's very difficult to provide any reliable data. What we know for sure is the data that was coming a few months and few weeks before the start of the war in 2014. It seems to me January or February of 2014, the last data was for Crimea, where the question was asked, again, Ukrainian pollsters were doing that, and were doing that for a number of years. The question was asked whether you basically support the existence of Russia and Ukraine as they are, whether you think that they should be the one state, or whether you think that they should be different states but with the borders that are porous. And the news were not good for Ukraine in a sense that 35 or 36% actually in Crimea in February of 2014 were saying that actually they were in favor of Russia and Ukraine being one and the same state. Right? So to a degree, some variation also on the Russians and Ukrainians, one and the same people, not exactly, but certainly bordering on that. But that was not the argument, okay, that Crimea should become part of Russia, right? So that question was never asked. For Donbass, we know that before 2014, the majority of the population was actually saying that they want to stay in Ukraine. And majority, it's basically close to 70 to 80%, almost the same amount that, little bit less, but almost the same amount that voted for Ukrainian independence in 1991. After that, we just don't have reliable data. What I can assume is that after 8 years of war, not only Ukrainian society in Ukraine changed, but also the population on the occupied territories changed. First of all, the pro-Ukrainian, mostly cultural, but not only cultural elements left Crimea, left Donbass, part of the Crimean Tatars. We now see this, our friends and colleagues there in the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, they're in Transcarpathia, they're in other places. So the political and cultural Ukrainian element actually couldn't survive under the occupation. Either they were arrested, like Professor Kozlovsky, and eventually released, or they had to flee right away. The Donbass is overtaxed in terms of the number of people who had been recruited into the Russian armed forces and as the result died on the battlefield. So your member of your family dying on the battlefield in the war with Ukraine certainly unlikely makes you pro-Ukrainian. So my again, we don't have the data, but my guess is that really two Ukraines in that sense are moving further apart, depending on which side of the border they ended up to.
Thank you. Paniana, please.
My question refers to Putin's doctrine, and would you agree that if we would have had a scholarly conference on Ukrainian statehood, in other words, the proclamation of Ukrainian independence on the 100th anniversary of the proclamation of Ukraine's independence, it would be more difficult for Putin to publish his infamous doctrine. Unfortunately, a conference on a world scale, a conference that would be comparable to what Americans held in in 1976, on the 200th anniversary of American Revolution and independence, did not take place either in Ukraine, shortage of scholars, or also in Western world. Unfortunately, it was only Entisha and also the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences that were able to organize a conference on a rather modest scale in view of the funds that were available. Would you agree that if this particular question would have been discussed on a world scale among scholars, it would have been more difficult for Putin to write his doctrine and actually persuade some people that indeed he may be right?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
If such a conference was conducted in Russia by Russian scholars, that would be a very different Russia and certainly much more difficult for Putin to publish this article. If it would be conducted somewhere outside of Russia, I think it would be easier for him to make his argument, because it is basically an argument that accuses West of turning Ukraine into anti-Russia, so that would not make a difference, or if make a difference, of a different kind.
Thank you. Please.
What did the Russo-Ukrainian-War
Raise your voice.
what did Russo-Ukrainian-War or ability of Ukraine to fight back, to stand, change among American, Western historians, scholars? And did it change their stereotypes, opinion, and thoughts?
Well, thank you for this question. This is also part of the discussion that was happening here at the panel in the second half of the day. The biggest issue that is being debated now by the Association for Slavic and East European Studies, as was mentioned, the largest association of that sort in the world, is decolonization. There would be no that topic, there would be no those discussions without what happened in Ukraine. And sometimes when people talk about the impact of the war, they talk about the impact of the war using that particular term. For me, this is more the impact of the Ukrainian resistance. Because if the war would last for 2 weeks, there would be very little war and not no impact at all, but there would be a very limited impact at all. There would be very limited impact overall. The field is, I can't say changing, but the field is in disarray, looking for for basically new ground under the feet, and it depends on the field as a whole, but also people in the Ukrainian studies to really not to waste this opportunity to bring the field to the new level, on the level on which decolonization, that certainly as a term, as an academic term, started with the British and French and other studies, to what degree they transformed the field. The field of Russo-centric studies is basically 3-4 decades behind of what is happening in other fields of historians. So for people in the Russian, Soviet, Eurasian studies, sometimes very difficult to find common ground with their colleagues working on Latin America, or on French history, or French colonial empire. And I don't want to exaggerate, but certainly they are on different waves in terms of what is important, what is not important in their respective fields.
Thank you. Markia.
So thank you very much for the, I take your point about the end of the pan-Russian idea, at least insofar as Ukraine is concerned. Whether it gets to Russia is a different question. But I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how the war has changed Ukrainian society as well. Because it seems to me that you're absolutely right, that between 2014 and 2022, Ukrainians began to think about politics differently and began to relate to their country and to the war that they had been fighting for 8 years with volunteer movements and getting things to the front and all the great sacrifices that they made for the 8 years before February 22nd. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how ideas about Ukrainian nationhood and citizenship evolved as a result.
Well, thank you for this question. My talk, maybe it wasn't very obvious, but consisted out of two parts. The one where I talked wearing a hat of intellectual historian, and I have some credentials for wearing that hat. And then there was another part about talking about the contemporary Ukrainian society, where I don't have the hat and don't have the correct credentials. So that what you heard from me was basically an observations of a layperson from things that are just obvious and impossible to ignore. So with it's an excellent question. I don't think I'm really qualified to answer it in depth that the question really deserves to be answered.
Yeah, please. I do not see you.
In relation to the cartography in the 16th and 17th century, what was the official name under which Moscow and St. Petersburg were listed under? Because in the current Wikipedia, if anybody just looks it up in brevity, you find the name Rus, which I know was absolutely correct. What were the actual cartographic names that it was listed? Pre-Catherine the Great.
Well, thank you. The trick is that there were many maps, and no world commission that would introduce particular standards. For me personally, the most disappointing thing was that the maps could be actually 80, 90 years late in terms of presenting particular realities. So what we have more often than not would be a combination of different terms. There would be Moscovia, there would be also Russia. The same term, not Moscovia, but some forms of Russia would be applied also for parts of today's Ukraine. So it was really very very unregulated situation. And from that point of view, I just want to warn somebody from going to a particular map and on the basis of one map and one particular usage, making broader some kind of conclusions. What we know for sure that really 18th century, that's where the Russian Empire enters the European politics, and that means enters the European map making world. Before that, the map makers in Germany, in Italy, mostly they would look at the region either through the prism of the Polish terminology or because of the Ottoman Wars and what was happening in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. And then they would go back and forth. So there was, we tried to impose the order where it didn't exist. What we know by the 18th century is that given the new importance of the Russian Empire, they successfully move in the mind of Enlightenment, on the map of the Enlightenment, they move the border of Europe from today's River Don to the Ural Mountains. And this is the development of the 18th century. That's how the power of the Russian Empire changes the world map-making business. 16th, 17th century, I would say Moscovia would be most popular term in Western cartography. To what degree that reflected reality on the ground, I don't think it reflected. So the term Rus was used by different parts of the former Kievan Rus. That was the reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an illuminating talk. I wonder if you could maybe discuss more of the issue whether or not using this particular idea or some other idea is just a matter of expediency for this particular Russian regime. And kind of the reason I'm asking that, because we have other events preceding the kind of aggression against Ukraine, such as the Russo-Georgian War, right, and the annexation of certain parts, but also escalating relations, the kind of tensions that Russia had with Poland, right, kind of the whole Smolensk tragedy, as we know, and other matters that were escalating there, with the Baltic states as far as the Czech Republic as well. So kind of, if you could situate that in that.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, my reading, geopolitical reading of this war, is that the war is very much about the Russia trying to reinstate its control over the post-Soviet space, with the goal of really reconfiguring the world order. Because since 1991, it became clear that Russia can't be another superpower. They're unhappy with the monopolar world, which basically American world, the way how it existed in the 90s. The idea was multipolar world, where Russia would be one of the poles, but other poles would be European Union and China. And for Russia to be a pole, you need really, in one way or another, mobilize resources of a much larger space. Ukraine, the second largest republic of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union fell on the count of Ukraine 1 week after Ukrainian referendum was dissolved. So rebuilding all of that space without Ukraine would be impossible. That's my geopolitical reading. Now there are a number of different ideological concepts that are being used depending on how situation develops politically and militarily. That doesn't mean that the regime or people who are involved in that are completely cynical in adopting those tools. My personal belief that Putin committed and believes in the idea of, in Solzhenitsyn's basically idea, or Solzhenitsyn's reinterpretation of the idea of one Russian nation. But he is certainly also, again, uses tools in his toolbox depending on what is happening on the front line. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, please.
Thank you. I love what you just said. How do the Crimean Tatars fit into this worldview of one nation? I mean, they're obviously not Slavs, and they fit more in the mold of the Central Asian peoples.
Right. You're talking about Russian thinking, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes. Well, the solution was there just to kick the Crimean Tatars out of the Crimea, right? And replace them with Russians and Ukrainians, with basically Slavs, which would fit the paradigm of one Russian nation. That was the policy for a long period of time. Crimean Tatars were just one of the so-called quote-unquote punished nations. The Chechens were others and so on, who were accused of collaborating with the Germans and exiled to Kazakhstan, to other parts, either of Russia or of the Soviet Union. But every other punished nation was unpunished, or to a degree unpunished, after 1956. Only Crimean Tatars were not allowed to return until the last really waning days of the Soviet Union, which meant that an exception was made in the case of the Crimean Tatars. They were not supposed to be there for a number of reasons, but they came back. And then we have Russia really struggling, today's Russia, struggling with a number of not just intellectual but also broader social and ethnic and ethnographic processes that happen in Russia. Russia, for the first time in its history, or at least in the last 2, 3, 4 centuries, is the country in which ethnic Russians constitute the majority. It wasn't the case before December of 1991. Which means that there are much less limits on the development of Russian nationalism in its different forms. because there is less threat that the non-Russians would rebel. And but still there are Chechens, there are Yakuts, there are others, and Russia today plays this game of basically of Российский народ, which would include ethnic Russians, but also other groups as well. But if you look at the policy is on all levels, from political to cultural to others, is basically Russification. The same policy that is being brought to Crimea, to the southern Ukraine, to eastern Ukraine under the Russian occupation. This is not the communist or the Soviet policy where we would politically not allow you to develop, but we would allow you to have schools in Ukrainian, we would allow you to have dance groups and the all sorts of cultural activities that were allowed, ensemble Virskoho and so on and so forth in the Soviet Union. None of that is happening now in Russia. So Russia is a classic nationalizing state where for the first time Russians are the majority, and there are attempts to turn in one way or another into Russians other groups. The latest concluding words of Putin during his press conference was that, well, we should believe in Русский, российский народ. So Русский as the core, and then Российский, which is broader. It's not Soviet anymore, right? It's not Eurasian народ. It is Российский. Российский, again, something that comes out of Русский. It comes out and closely related to that. So yeah, they have a situation in which they try to build Rусский nation state with very much remaining to be, not to the same degree they were before 91, but still remaining to be a very imperial space, not only physically, but also culturally and linguistically, and religiously, of course.
Yes. Serhii, thank you so much for your great thought-provoking talk. My question request would be to comment on the context of Belarus, and where does Belarus fit, both Belarus as something that Russia was able to crush, especially if we're thinking about the revolution of 2021, but also the existence now of Belarusian government in exile, Belarusian elites in exile, and how they're trying to mobilize. Where does Belarus fit in, since it was part of the idea of the greater Russian nation and also of the bigger Russia that to annex, so two of the three ideologies that you talked about.
Thank you. Belarus is very much the country that still has to build its nation. Right? In Ukraine, this is a very, very difficult and long process, which was accelerated after 2013 and even more after 2022. Belarus never went through that sort of experience, and we really don't know whether Belarusians will exist as a separate nation. It's an open question. The question whether Ukrainians would exist as a separate nation was given in the first weeks of March of 2022. Right? With Belarusians, we don't have this answer. My personal belief that a lot in Belarusian history will depend on the outcome of war in Ukraine. Recently, there were good news for Ukraine. Not many good news are coming these days from anywhere for Ukraine, but there were good news about the opening of the negotiations on the Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union. Ukraine was not the only country that was in that package. Moldova was as well, right? Georgia was either given or invited to a candidate status. What did Georgia do? What did Moldovans did recently? Ukrainians resisted. Ukraine changed the dynamic. And what is true for Moldova and to Georgia would be even more true for Belarus. But again, this is an open question.
The official position coming out of Ukraine very often right now is that we're fighting for Europe. So if we don't stand, they're going to come after you with Lithuania and Poland and so on and so forth. But what you're saying is kind of contradicts that, because like the idea of Russian nation is much smaller than that. In fact, it doesn't even include Galicia, right? So to what extent that official position is actually, to your mind, is truthful, or is it more rhetoric of, building up consensus?
I think it is truthful, because let's look at the countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are members of NATO, members of the European Union, but part of the former imperial space, part of the former Russian, of the Soviet Union. And these are the countries that are also on the list in terms of the per GDP. Their contribution to the Ukrainian war effort are the largest in the world, which for me is an indication that basically whatever rhetoric coming from Kiev vis-a-vis Europe certainly is treated very seriously by the Baltic states. And you talk to the Poles, and they're convinced absolutely that they would be next as well. Again, I don't want to overuse those comparisons with Anschluss, with 1930s, but that's the story that very much echoes for me, the story of the 1930s and the rise of Germany, which started with the Anschluss and Sudetenland and so on and so forth, but then went much further than that. Syrians are not Slavs, right? and not part of the big Russian nation, but the something that starts with basically national or nationalist ideology with the imperial overtones doesn't end on the borders of particular language or particular groups. And again, even with, in the case of Ukraine, I put the one big Russian nation model, one Russian idea, on par with Eurasian, Eastern, and Greater Russia, and certainly again, the imperial toolbox, ideologically, intellectually, unfortunately, is quite extensive.
Oksana, please.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about the church, because as you said, the Orthodox Church serves this sort of as a glue and a conduit of this greater pan-Russian notion or idea. And of course, in Ukraine, the government has been trying to ban the Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, is exactly with that argument that they are kind of the conduit of this Russian imperial ideology, which the church itself denies and says, well, we changed our statute, and but not everybody agrees that they really mean it. So my question is, do you think this Moscow Patriarchate Church currently continues to serve this function, or wants to continue to serve this function, and it clearly proved much harder for the government to ban the church than they had with pro-Russian parties or TV channels and so forth. So kind of the role that the church could play or would continue to play in that geopolitical
Sure. Thank you. The church was on my on a list of things to talk, and then I just ran out of time. So thank you for asking this question. I talked about the church as basically being an institutional embodiment of the idea of the pan-Russian nation, which certainly continued beyond 1991. And the Kharkiv Sobor of 1992 was really the victory of the pan-Russian idea over the idea of Ukrainian church and Ukrainian autocephaly. So the current church, Russian Orthodox Church or Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, was really born out of Kharkiv Sobor with the reimposing the idea of one Russian nation. The party was gone. The Soviet Union was gone. But the institution that professed the idea of the pan-Russian nation survived and disposed one of its main persons of the previous decade, Patriarch Filaret. So that's how powerful the idea was. The war started in 2014 with the scandals about the priests of the Moscow Patriarchate, let's call it for the sake of clarity, refusing to conduct services for the Ukrainian soldiers who were killed on the battlefield from their own villages, from their own towns, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting what happened in 2022, where the head of the church actually clearly and publicly disagreed with Patriarch Kirill and appealed to Putin, talking about the fratricidal war and talking about the sin of Cain, right? So that was by the standards of the church language and the standards of the church born out of the victory of the pan-Russian idea, quite a significant development. It followed with then May Council, where they declared themselves to be independent or administratively independent, or whatever that means. Continuing their connection and their relation to the Moscow Patriarchate, and that's where the government found itself, with certainly the church being for a long period of time also institutional channel for Russian influences, and the not just declared goal, but actually the actual goal of the Ukrainian resistance of maintaining democracy and maintaining pluralistic society. And that's where we are right now, and there is no easy way out of that. The government, and again, you know about that more than I do, so I'm really simplifying here. But government now is using whatever tools it has in its own toolbox, and that's basically withdrawing the right to use the buildings that belong to the government, that are owned by the government, like Cave and Caves Monastery. Where that would lead, how long that would take, it's very difficult to say. As a historian looking at that in the long-term kind of perspective, it's very clear that the Orthodox Church in Ukraine will become independent. With the appearance of another legitimate and Orthodox Church branch, and this is the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, I think the writing is on the wall. That's also one of the reasons of this resistance. Resistance is also about, again, anyone who is familiar with the wars in Ukrainian diaspora about jurisdictions, wars in church buildings, and so on and so forth, know that it's not only about the religious dogma, it's also the ownership of the buildings, it's also the power of the bishops, and we see now just the repetition of those wars happening in Ukraine itself. So there is a temptation in an election like that to reduce everything to the idea and the battle of ideas, but fortunately or unfortunately, there is much more at play than the clash of ideas.
Thank you. Yeah, we should take into consideration that there are more than 8,000 communities that are submitted to the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. 8,000. Yeah, please, Alexandra.
So if Putin's essay was based on Solzhenitsyn, I guess it's some rhetorical question, but what does it say about Russian opposition and liberal way of thinking? And what's the relationship between Ivan Ilyin and Solzhenitsyn staying on the same issues, which it's believed that Putin actually also was taken into consideration Ivan Ilyin's writings when he used Ukraine and Ukrainian question.
Okay, I didn't hear everything that you said. Maybe I'll get closer.
So I was asking. So I was asking about the correlation between Ivan Ilyin's take on Ukraine overall on those issues and Ukraine's question and Solzhenitsyn's approach, and overall, what does it say about Russian position and the Russian liberal way of thinking? Because Solzhenitsyn is so adored in the West.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned before, Tim Snyder is really an expert on Ilyin and how it was reflected in the political rhetoric in Russia today. As far as I understand, Ilyin basically doesn't particularly spend sleepless nights thinking about Ukraine, so his view is broader. But one point is that Ilyin and Solzhenitsyn are not liberals. There are different forms of nationalists in Russia. So from that point of view, the views of philosophers like that, they're certainly popular. There are people who support it and so on and so forth, but this is not about liberals and liberal movement in Russia. The liberals are basically those who either publicly protested against the war or left Russia, and we have the largest political immigration from Russia today since the revolution of 1917. And again, one of the people who again is well known in this audience, and already her name was mentioned, Tatiana Tairova-Yakovleva. Again, she's not the only one who did that. So maybe I am wrong, but I don't think that there are Russian liberals who particularly worship Solzhenitsyn, and certainly not Ilyin.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Serhii, for such an enlightening lecture.
I'm so sorry.
The question that I have is coming from a first-generation Ukrainian in the diaspora who's very familiar with everything you talked about, but I learned a tremendous amount. And I think everyone in the room here understands the issue of Ukraine versus Russia. Sitting at the dinner table with parents and grandparents, I heard Moskva це є ворог України і все буде. What you said today is fairly complex. As an intellectual historian, how would you educate the world leaders who have to deal with this conflict in Ukraine, given the fact that in the 50s and the 60s, Moscow and Petersburg funded Russian programs at the elite academic institutions throughout Europe and in the United States? Because in the end, does economics really trump political sovereignty?
Well, economics are a very important factor and continue to be a very important factor on all levels. Today, the war in Ukraine is about who has more shells, right? It's military issue, but it's economic issue as well. So, not to dismiss importance of funding and economics, and I am personally a beneficiary of another power of economics, and that coming from the Ukrainian community, funding of institutions like Shevchenko Society, like the chairs at Harvard. The chairs would not be there, I would not be standing here without the power of basically very much economically powerless community, but that mobilized its resources. So it is important. Now the question of how you educate anybody, and the focus is actually not being too complex in your argument. The story that at least the way how I look at it. There are different perspectives on the war in Ukraine. I was given geopolitical, I was given intellectual history. But something that is really globally appealing is that this war that is unique in many ways and complex in many ways is still a very simple in the way how it should be perceived, and I perceive it personally. This is one of the many wars of the disintegration of empires and emergence of independent states on their ruins. From the Russian side, it's an imperial war, there is no question about that. Half of my talk was about elements of imperial ideology and justification of it. From Ukrainian side, it's actually relatively, banal war for Ukraine, for independence of the country that happened from Latin America to the American Revolution, potentially inaugurated the revolt against the European empires, even before Latin America went that way. So we are in a very difficult and dramatic point in Ukrainian history and history of Eastern Europe. But for the world as a whole, this is not a new phenomenon. And in that sense, my argument to anybody, either on the academic side, on the political side, on the side of people who know a lot about the country, or Ukraine, or doesn't know about the country, is that this is war of the disintegration of empires. And as a historian, I'm very optimistic long term because I know how these wars end. But I also know that it can take time. The story that we see now, the disintegration of the Russian Empire, started in 1914. It still continues. The British Empire didn't fall apart after the American Revolution. The Ottoman Empire didn't fall apart in the 18th century. So, as a human being, I'm very concerned about what is happening today and what is happening, what will happen tomorrow. As a historian, I know where we are going, and again, this is a global story. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Давайте подякуємо нашому прекрасному